Hello, everyone. In today's episode, I want to talk to you a little bit about how to structure your image in value. I'm going to be using two of my students' work as a critique paint over in order to talk a little bit about this topic. This is super important when you're working, whether you're working in black and white or in color. You have to be able to structure your image in value the more simple way, so it's a little bit easier to read when somebody looks at your work. I also want to remind you that there's only 2 spots left for my mentorship program. It's going to start in August 24. So if you want to build your portfolio, you want to have somebody with you to guide you through all that process, make sure that you check that out. But let's talk a little bit about value structure in your images, and I hope that you guys get something out of it. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about something that is extremely important, especially when we're working in color. It's a little bit harder because we got to deal with colors, right? But when we are working on black and whites, it's a little bit easier because we're actually just seeing it right the way it is. And this is going to be the value structure. What I mean by value is your gradients from black to white, or the values of the materials or the colors that you have in your scene. And so your value structure is really going to be the one of the main key ingredients on how your image is going to read to the viewer. Whether the person knows about values or not, they're going to perceive your value structure subconsciously, right? Even if it's in color, because each color has its own value. And so now I have this image here, and this is from one of my students, and I think it was a good opportunity to talk about this because even though the question wasn't about values, right? The question was if you have something that looks like this with this sort of detail, right? With all this wooden stuff, very detailed, and you have this sort of thing in the foreground. How can you apply this to further things in the background and further away? Do you have more? Do you increase the size? Like, how do you do that? And even though that has its own answer, uh, that answer is going to be rooted into your value structure, right? And so when I look at the image and I start thinking about that particular question, I realize that there's even a bigger problem than how I'm going to add this amount of detail into all these further out, areas. And the bigger issue is your value structure. So as you can see here, I'm going to make some notes here. If you can see here, right, we have let me move this to RGB colors. Okay, actually, mode RGB, don't fly. Just so we can see the color here very quickly. We have this area here in the foreground, right? And we have this thing going like this into this other floating island. And then I can see a little bit of some of these other bridges going into this one, and then a bigger one way back here in the background, right? Now, when I look at it, right, and as you can see here, we know that if we have a camera and we're going to look at this from the top, we're looking at it from the top, right? And there's a subject matter here, let's say a character here, and there's something here, and there's something here. And let's say this is 5 feet, this is 500 meters, and this is like 3,000 meters or something like that, like really far away, right? The further away that I'm from the camera, right, the less contrast I'm going to have, right? The closer I am, the more contrast, right? And so if I just know this, right? So if I know that something that's further out has less contrast, and I look at this, right? I can tell that there's a lot of areas here that I have a lot of contrast, right? So this is a very high contrasty area, even though it's pretty far away, right? And then you have all these little variations of value and changes in value, even though these are clouds, that are making all these different, like all these areas and this, all these areas filled with contrast. And then if I look at my foreground, right, it's almost like they're competing with each other, right? Especially this right here. This almost looks like the same as this over here. And so I want to make sure that every time I'm working on an image, my value structure, right, depending on what I have in the image, is very simple and easy to read, right? And so, for example, another thing is like, this seems, and again, I'm sort of assuming certain things because I don't have the full context of the image, but I'm assuming all this is sky, right? But the sky, it's like darker and have all these contrasty clouds against these structure here in the center, but then back here is lighter. And so it's a little bit confusing the way things are established by their value. Another thing is, for example, this structure here, I'm guessing this area here, if I was standing here, I'm going to be closer to the camera than if I'm standing here on this island or even here, right? But the value here is very less contrasty than over here, right? And so is the value structure is a little bit all over the place. So every time I have something like this at my value, and this happens to all of us, right? We always have to come back and sort of simplify our value structure. I always want to simplify things as simple as possible and then build up from there. And so if I were to do or represent this image here in a more simple value structure, right? I will have, let's say I have my sky here, and I'm going to do this with very basic shapes just so we can see that. Let's go to grayscale here. I'm going to have we can put this, let's do this, that. I'm going to have my foreground element, right? Which is here, which is where that sort of character is. We have some structure here, and we could add all this detail and all that stuff with the wood and all that, right? And then we have this sort of older island that is maybe here. And again, I'm going to do this very, very simple. And then I have another island back here, right, which is this big one here. And then I have that big, big, big island. Maybe covers this whole thing, right? And we only see a little bit of sky here, or maybe we can see a little bit of sky here, but you can design that the way you want to, right? Sort of like a little bit that maybe covers this whole thing. We only see a little bit of the sky. So our image is sort of flowing a little bit this way, maybe, right? So this is like the simplest version of this in terms of the value structure, right? And so when I start adding details, I don't want to go into this island here and then start doing this sort of thing, right? Where I'm adding all these range of values into the structure because, this is pretty far away. So it's not going to have as much contrast. And the same thing is going to be for this one and for this one, right? And so if I were to add details to this really far back one, it's going to be almost very subtle, right? And I'm almost going to flatten out the details because I don't want to start adding like cuts of rock like this. And you can see that I'm using the same value as this one. It's going to start making it a little bit more confusing. And so whether I am painting the details or if I am doing photo batching and all that, I want to make sure that I keep the same value structure as I do this. Let's do this here, right? And so that's going to be the very first thing that I take a look when I look at an image like this. Like worrying about how I'm going to add all this detail through the background is really on the lowest priority in an image like this because I want to make sure that the value structure is correct, right? And once I fix that, then I can move on to those other things, right? So I hope that makes sense. Now I did a very quick paint over, probably about I think it was like 20 minutes, 15 minutes over this. I did a couple of changes based on what we talked about, right? Let me fill this out. You can play with the shapes of this and all that however you want to, but I want to make sure that I keep the same value structure. And some of the things that I did was I still use this image here, right? To get the shapes, right? And you can see that I added them here into the background. but I almost flattened the color. Like there's no barely any detail or anything like that. And the same thing here. And I can probably clean up a little bit of this area here by maybe painting over it just to simplify things, right? A little bit. So it doesn't become very contrasty, right? But the way our brain works is that, I have all this detail here in the foreground and going down into the distance. And if I just have the silhouette of something similar here back here, even though it doesn't have a lot of detail, like my brain knows that this thing here is part of this wooden sort of structure. And even if I have it all the way back here, my brain sort of can put it together. So I don't need to have all the details and all that into there. I can just simply go into like creating a layer here, and I can even just do this, just grab this value here and just start adding into this, keeping the same sort of design language that I have in the foreground, right? And my brain is sort of going to put it together and know that this is the same thing, right? The same thing with the pieces of rock and island, right? So I have this one here, I have this one here, then I have this one here and this one here, right? And so my brain sort of knows what that is. And so you can work this, as much as you want, but I want to make sure that you keep the same value structure. And if there's something that, like a new layer here, and if there's something that goes from foreground to middle ground, very consistent like that, then you need to have that gradient of value change as it goes through the distance. Let me clear this. Now, let's say that I wanted to add more detail to this island here. Let's say I'm going to do some photo batching here. I'm going to keep the same principle, right? So let's say I bring this image here. I want to add some details. So, right. So I'm going to bring it here. Right. I'm going to play with my blending modes here just to see which one could work. Right. So let's say I like this, but you can see that the value on this is very bright. So it's giving me a lot of contrast. Now, if there was a situation where maybe the light source, right, was hitting this area and was making it super bright, then maybe I could leave it like that, right? So maybe I could do something where, let's say, I have something like this, and I put a mask on it. I'm gonna get rid of the areas that I don't want, right? So I don't want this, right? And maybe there was a shaft of light sort of hitting that area. So maybe I could have something like that, right? But if I don't, if this is more like a diffuse sort of lighting, then I'm gonna grab that picture or that image and I'm gonna reduce the value a little bit. Just to kind of suggest the detail, right? And I can duplicate it, right? Rotate it, maybe add a little bit more somewhere on another side like that, right? And then from there, I can continue on, maybe add, some more detail and whatnot, right? But I don't want to go too different with the values in here because then that's going to throw off the value structure that I already have. Okay. And so if I were to do the same thing for clouds and stuff like that, right? Instead of adding a cloud like this, right, where it's adding so much contrast, I'm almost going to bring it closer to my value on the sky. So I'm going to make it probably even darker, something like that. Maybe I can bring this back. Maybe something like that, right? Maybe even darker, right? Just very subtle like this, right? And that gives me enough to know that these are clouds. I mean, I may have to play a little bit with the values on some of these areas, right? Like here, right? But I want to make sure again that even though it doesn't matter the technique, I want to make sure that that I keep the same value structure. Now, let's say I wanted to add more detail to the very far island here. Now I have to be even more careful. Maybe I can even use the same image. We'll see how that works. Let's bring it down here. Let's make it a little bit bigger. Let's see it. Let's bring it into normals here. I'm gonna rotate it. Oops. Like so. I'm gonna clip it to that. Oops, is this one here in the back. I clip it here. I'm gonna sort of place it first where I want it, right? I'm gonna play with the blending modes just to see what I get first. I'm mostly looking for the shapes of the shadows and the light source, right? I'm gonna play with the value a little bit. Something like that. And I could even use it like this in normal blending mode, right? But I'll have to play with the values a lot. So something like this. And I just get rid of the areas that I don't want. Right? I can even duplicate that, play with the shape. You can get rid of this lighter area. Right? And so you can see that I'm being careful about how much detail I'm putting in into the scene in terms of contrast. And of course, at the end, you can sort of play with a little bit of adding a little bit more atmosphere, soft brush, maybe grab a little bit of that value on the sky. Just maybe add a little bit more here on the top. Maybe not too much there. Right? And so now you can see that but it's a little bit more control the values, right? So when I compare it to the first one, right, then you can see how much contrast there is all around on the old one, right? And this is a little bit more controlled and thoughtful about, you know, where exactly I want the values. Okay, so this is another example, right? Same sort of issues and problems. Now, this one in particular has some particular things that I wanted to talk about. And the first one is the, you know, the when you look at the elements in the image, right? We have foreground element, sort of midground, midground, you know, midground here, and then background back here, right? They all have sort of like the same setup of contrast, as you can see, right? It has the dark and then the light, the dark and the light, dark and the light. And so we want to make sure that that doesn't happen all throughout the image from foreground to background, right? It's always going to change because of the value contrast, because of atmospheric perspective and all these other things, right? And so what happens is that sort of like flattens your image out. And so you want to be aware of that. The other thing is that if you look closely, some of these elements have light coming from one side, and then some others have coming light from the other side. And so you want to make sure that when you add those details or those lights, you're consistent with the lighting that you have throughout the whole image, and that way it doesn't look confusing. And some people might notice exactly what that is, but when they look at it, they know that something is sort of off or wrong. And so you want to make sure that those things match throughout your whole image. Now I did a quick paint over here. Just to kind of simplify a little bit of things here. Again, I did the same process that I did on the previous one. Of course, I could add more detail into this area here, maybe the sky a little bit, but you want to see how, you know, you can see how I simplify the value structure of the image, and it reads a lot better, right, when I'm far away than when I do this, right? Same composition, same elements, right? But this is a lot more simple in its value structure. And then once you have that established, then you can go in, add the details while keeping in mind, of course, the value structure. And so this is just another example of how you can just make it a little bit more readable.